Have you ever heard of the Death Cave ritual? Behind our village, the mountainside is riddled with countless caves, densely packed like dark secrets. In our community, when someone becomes elderly, frail, or incapacitated, their children dig a cave and abandon them there to perish, a cruel tradition passed down through generations. My grandmother was one of its victims. 2 months after my grandmother was sent into the death cave, my younger brother was born. Yet what should have been a joyous occasion was shrouded in horror, for my brother bore the face of my grandmother. This child cannot stay. That wretched old woman must have cursed him with her spite. My frail mother, her gaze icy and venomous, glared at the swaddled infant without a shred of tenderness. She gestured sharply at my father. "Take him to the ravine behind the mountain. Don't let me see him again." Through the cracked door, I caught a glimpse of my father cradling the baby. I stifled a gasp, covering my mouth. My newborn brother, still smeared with blood and grime, had a tiny, wrinkled face, a face that mirrored my grandmother's. My father, pale as death, lowered his head, silent. That night, the piercing cries vanished. Hiding behind the door, I watched my father's shadow grow distant, trembling until I drifted into a troubled sleep. Half conscious, I felt a faint breath brush my cheek, accompanied by whispersoft, indistinct murmurs, like a baby's whimpering mixed with my grandmother's low moans. At dawn, rustling sounds came from the backyard. My heart pounded as I stumbled outside. The air was thick with a sickening stench, making me gag. Looking up, I froze. There in the pigsty lay my 2-day-old brother. He moved with startling agility, like a monkey, burying half his head into the trough to devour pig slop. His bloated belly stretched tight and translucent, writhing with movement inside. Unable to hold it back, I vomited. The brother discarded in the ravine had returned. News of my mother giving birth to a monster spread like wildfire through the village. Crowds gathered to gawk, and even the revered Elder Wu was summoned. After a grave calculation, his expression darkened. End quote. This child carries immense resentment. He's possessed by the vengeful spirit of your deceased mother-in-law. If left unchecked, disaster will follow. Elder Wu advised us to nurture the child with love until he reached 100 days old, to dissolve his hatred. Yet that very night, my mother secretly carried my brother to the ravine and buried him alive. Late at night, I overheard hushed voices from my parents' room. Pressing my ear to the wall, I heard my mother's cold tone. "Only a fool would wait 100 days. The sooner he dies, the sooner I can conceive a proper son." Her words were cut short by a scream. Rushing in, I saw Himi brother returned once more. His face, identical to my grandmother's, was contorted with malice as he stared at my mother. My father lay lifeless on the floor, and my brother, baring sharp teeth, lunged at my mother, tearing a chunk from her flesh. My mother's agonized cries faded into unconsciousness. My brother turned his gaze toward me. His clouded, grayish eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to my grandmother's. Screaming, I fled to my room, hiding under my blanket. I heard the door creak open and felt his gaze settle on me. Footsteps retreated into the distance before I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The aroma of breakfast wafted from the kitchen as my father prepared food as if nothing had happened. He told me to call my mother, saying she was feeding my brother. Entering the room, I saw her cradling the swaddled baby, her face radiating bliss, but half her face was a mangled mess of raw flesh and exposed bone. My brother's lips glistened with red, yet my mother appeared oblivious, her eyes filled with maternal love. It all reminded me of a haunting secret. One night, I had seen my mother piercing iron wires into my grandmother's fingertips, sneering, "As long as I fill her body with 10 wires, I'll bear sons from now on." My grandmother's muffled screams were silenced by a rag stuffed into her mouth. My father, with a heavy sigh, muttered, "Mother, don't blame me for being ruthless. Your dying anyway might as well help me secure a male heir. To have a son. My parents had become heartless monsters without even realizing it. My heart sank to the bottom of despair. That night, I waited until they had packed up, returned to their room, and extinguished the lights before I stealthily pushed open my grandmother's door. Grandma. My voice trembled, and so did my legs. Under the dim moonlight, her eyelids quivered. With all her remaining strength, she slowly opened her eyes. The kind and gentle woman I once knew was now frail and broken. Covering my mouth, I sobbed uncontrollably, tears falling in large droplets to the ground. Grandma, I called her again, choking on my words. She weakly grasped my hand, just as she did when I was a child. Her legs could no longer move. Whenever people asked, my mother would say she had accidentally fallen. But now, I knew the truth. Her legs had been stuffed with iron wires. Even the slightest movement would cause excruciating pain. Biting my lip, I hoisted her frail body onto my back, determined to take her away. But I only managed 2 steps before collapsing to the ground. Grandma's body rolled like a log, hitting something with a loud crash that pierced the night's silence. Before I could get up, my parents stormed in. My father kicked me to the ground. You worthless brat! What are you doing up in the middle of the night? Get back to your room, or I'll sell you to the butcher on the east side of the village. What followed was a brutal beating, more severe than any before. I lay in bed for 2 full days before I could move. 3 nights later, the 10th iron wire was forced into my grandmother's body. My mother brought out coarse fishing thread and began sewing my grandmother's mouth shut, stitch by agonizing stitch. Sew it tight, she muttered to my father. Tight enough that she can't tell Lord Yama a thing when she reaches the underworld. The dense stitches crawled across her face like a grotesque centipede, ugly and horrifying. Bright red beads of blood seeped out, soaking her collar in an instant. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? The sharp voice of 5th granduncle jolted me from my memories. His scolding tone softened when he saw my tears, and he sighed deeply. Your parents have been blinded by the evil spirit. If you'd come to me any later, they might have lost their lives, Sand. You would have shared their fate. I fell to my knees, begging him to save us. After a long pause, he relented. He handed me 4 iron nails and a blood-red jade pendant, instructing me to hammer the nails into the 4 corners of the courtyard at midnight. Drip a bit of your blood on each nail, he said. Afterward, wear the pendant and return to your room to rest. I'll ensure nothing happens to you. At midnight, I followed his instructions, trembling and drenched in sweat. Once the task was complete, I returned to my room and lay down, willing myself to sleep despite the turmoil in my heart. The pendant around my neck radiated a gentle warmth, calming me. Before I knew it, I had drifted off. I awoke in terror, a suffocating force pressing down on me. My eyes flew open to see countless grotesque old spirits hovering over my bed, their skeletal hands wrapped tightly around my neck. Their twisted faces glared at me, as if they wanted to tear me apart. I struggled desperately, feeling my strength ebb away as death's grip tightened. Just as I was about to give in, a talisman was slapped onto my forehead. The spirits shrieked and vanished like mist in the sunlight. I gasped for air, turning to see an old man emerge from the shadows. He yanked the pendant from my neck, his expression grim. You've got guts, girl, wearing a sulocking jade pendant like that. Whoever gave it to you intended to use your soul to feed an evil spirit. My heart raced as I recognized him, Uncle Zhang, from the west side of the village. Uncle Zhang was in his 60s, strong and solitary. Rumor had it he'd trained in martial arts before returning to live alone at the foot of the mountain. The villagers avoided him, calling him a child-eating monster. My mother had warned me to stay away from him, and I always did until now. But 5th granduncle gave it to me, I said, confused. He said it would protect me. Uncle Zhang snorted, his expression darkening. That old scoundrel. I should have known. He let out a bitter laugh. His family brought the Death Cave custom to this village over a century ago. They believe that gathering 10,000 cave souls will grant them immortality. Your grandmother is the 10,000th soul. I stared at him, frozen with disbelief. Your grandmother's resentment is so strong that she became an evil spirit and possessed your brother. To appease her, the old man planned to sacrifice your soul. The room spun around me. I didn't know whom to trust, fifth granduncle or Uncle Zhang. Seeing my hesitation, Uncle Zhang didn't press further. He crushed the jade pendant in his hand, the shards scattering like blood-red tears. If you change your mind, find me by midnight tomorrow. I stayed awake all night, staring at the shattered remains of the pendant. By morning, my mother was cooing over my brother, her face glowing with pride. Look at him, Yindi. Isn't he beautiful? So fair and lucky. But when I looked, all I saw was his shriveled, wrinkled face and sharp, menacing fangs. Come, hold his hand, she urged. I reached out hesitantly, his icy touch sending shivers through my bones. Suddenly, he let out an ear-piercing wail and sank his teeth into my mother's neck. Blood sprayed everywhere. But she only smiled and comforted him, as if she felt no pain. I screamed, "Mom, that's not my brother!" My outburst enraged the creature. He leapt from her arms and vanished into the shadows. My mother chased after him, laughing and screaming into the night. I followed as far as I could, but her figure disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, the villagers had gathered, horrified whispers filling the air. "Something terrible has happened," someone cried. "Yindi, your mother. She's dead, found by the Death Caves." My legs gave way as the words sank in. Her body was twisted, her abdomen hollowed out, intestines spilling onto the ground. Her hands clutched her own stomach, and her wide, bloodshot eyes glistened with an eerie mixture of agony and joy. Standing before the mountain of Death Caves, I felt countless eyes watching me from their dark, gaping mouths. Following the scent of blood, I stumbled upon my mother's corpse. Her body lay grotesquely twisted, her abdomen hollowed out, entrails scattered like a macabre painting. One hand remained buried in her belly, her eyes bulging as though about to burst, filled with agony and a perverse thrill. I stood frozen, my legs trembling, cold sweat soaking my clothes as a chilling frost crept into my bones. Granduncle arrived, his face tightening as he took in the horrific scene. His gaze, sharp and probing, landed on me. "Yingdi, tell me, what happened last night?" he demanded, his tone filled with suspicion. Instead of answering, my fear and confusion found an unexpected outlet in a question that had haunted me. "Granduncle, why must the elderly be buried alive in the cave to await death?" His expression darkened instantly, his earlier kindness evaporating. "How dare you? A little girl like you knows nothing. Who's been filling your head with nonsense?" I took a step back instinctively, putting distance between us. "No one," I stammered, my voice trembling, but I dared not mention Uncle Zhang's warnings. Granduncle's eyes narrowed, scanning me from head to toe. When his gaze landed on my bare neck, his expression changed. "Where's the jade pendant I gave you?" "I lost it," I said, suppressing the panic bubbling in my chest and forcing a tone of apology. Granduncle sighed after a long pause, his hand brushing my forehead as though making a decision. "Lost is lost," he muttered. "What matters now is that your mother has been killed, and we must protect your father at all costs. Tomorrow, we'll go to the Death Cave, unearth your grandmother's remains, and give her a proper burial to dispel her wrath. Only then can this calamity be resolved." He turned, his gaze locking onto me with a strange intensity. "Yingdi, you'll do as I say, won't you?" Numbly, I nodded. "I'll listen to you, Granduncle." Pleased, he smiled. "Good girl. Go home and prepare." Since my mother's death, my father had become eerily lucid yet paralyzed with fear. Terrified of my grandmother's vengeful spirit, he sought refuge with Granduncle, pleading for protection. Reluctantly, Granduncle performed a ritual to mask his presence from ghosts, buying him temporary peace. He instructed us to prepare for the burial ceremony the following day. The next morning, we climbed the mountain together. Behind us, several pallbearers carried a crimson coffin meant to suppress vengeful spirits. The stench of decay hit us like a tidal wave as the bricks sealing the cave were broken. Covering my nose, I gazed at the grotesque remains of my grandmother, her face barely recognizable, but still bearing the stitched scars of her sewn-shut lips. I remembered that night vividly when my grandmother, frail and gasping, was forced into a straw basket scarcely a meter long. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting flickering shadows on her wrinkled face. Her lips oozed blood from the stitches, her muffled groans pleading for mercy. My mother, however, kicked the basket mercilessly, spitting on her with disdain. "You old hag! After all I've done for you, it's time you repay us. Once you're gone, I'll have sons with every pregnancy." Now, as the pallbearers moved her corpse into the coffin, the oppressive air thickened. Just as they were about to lift the coffin, someone screamed, "There's something inside!" A chilling silence fell. From within the crimson coffin came faint scraping sounds like nails clawing at the wooden lid. "Stop cowering!" Granduncle barked. "With me here, there's nothing to fear." Finally, the coffin was sealed and transported to the ancestral hall, locked in a room covered in talismans. Afterward, Granduncle handed me a small wooden bottle, his voice grave. "Tonight, your grandmother will come for you, but don't be afraid. Survive this final night, and her spirit will dissipate when the coffin is burned tomorrow. At dawn, prick your tongue and drop a bead of blood into this bottle. Bring it to me, and all will be well." I nodded, taking the bottle, but as I left, I caught a glimpse of something sinister flashing in his eyes. At dusk, Uncle Zhong sneaked into my yard, bringing a rooster whose blood he used to create protective barriers. "Your life is at stake," he warned, his words laced with a strange satisfaction. He mentioned iron wires within the body that wouldn't burn, planting seeds of suspicion in my mind. That night, my grandmother's spirit, hollow-eyed and rancid, returned. Possessing my brother's body, she demanded my father's whereabouts. Terrified, he cowered behind a door. Her vengeance was not for my mother, but for him, the true architect of her suffering. I pointed to the door. Her ghost lunged, dragging him out as his screams pierced the night. By morning, the yard was eerily quiet, bathed in sunlight. Calmly, I cleaned the bloodstains and delivered the bottle to Granduncle. He drank, his face twisting in agony. "What did you put in this?" he demanded. I smiled coldly. "Just fulfilling your karmic debt." Before he could strike, a figure emerged from the shadows. Uncle Zhong. "Your family's sins end here," he declared, hurling a talisman. Flames engulfed Granduncle, leaving nothing but charred bones. Uncle Zhong's voice turned solemn. "The cycle of karma is inescapable." I stared at him, my voice cutting through the silence. "And your karma, Uncle Zhong? Wasn't it you who taught my mother the ritual that led to all this?" His silence was answer enough. Seizing the moment, I plunged a blade into his chest. Poison laced the weapon, ensured his death. I gazed at him coldly, my eyes devoid of warmth. In a voice as soft as it was chilling, I said, "I am your reckoning."